Niall Ferguson, to start with China, are we heading for a new type of Cold War between our new two superpowers, China and the US?
Well, it certainly looks that way. It started off as a trade war. You might even say it started off as a campaign slogan of Donald Trump's in 2016. But we're now looking at something that's about much more than tariffs. If you look at the battle that's broken out over the Chinese telecoms company Huawei, you see that it has something of the features of the Cold War. There's a sort of global battle, the US trying to stop other countries adopting Huawei's technology because it fears that if Huawei builds 5G networks in too many countries, then Xi Jinping will sort of control the communications of half the world.
The Australian government itself has banned it from several large projects.
Right, and in some ways I think this emanated partly from the Australian intelligence and security community, who were a bit quicker than their American counterparts to see where China was going as it rolled out its technology. So I think this has certain common features with the Cold War. There's also a defense dimension to it. The Chinese are building a lot of weaponry which is probably designed to challenge American preeminence in the Asia-Pacific region. So tick that box. Ideological difference? You bet, because China isn't about to give up at least the appearance of communism and certainly one-party rule anytime soon. So I begin to think that we see many common features with what happened in the late 1940s, when the United States and the Soviet Union, which had been wartime allies, very quickly ended up in a kind of global race. Then, of course, it was about atomic and then hydrogen bombs. It was a nuclear arms race. Our Cold War looks like being a bit different. It's going to be an artificial intelligence arms race or a quantum computing arms race, certainly a high technology arms race. But I think in essentials, it's starting to look alarmingly like Cold War 2.0.
Economies generally don't thrive in wartime. How will economies perform if this does escalate?
Well, the good news is that as long as it doesn't become a hot war, a Cold War need not be economically harmful. If you think back to the original Cold War, actually it was characterized by some of the most rapid growth that the Western world has ever experienced. And the Soviet bloc did pretty well until towards the 1960s and 1970s, it all began to fall apart. So I think as long as this doesn't produce an actual hot war, as long as it takes the form of trade negotiations, as long as it takes the form of technological competition, it may actually be economically stimulative. After all, the US grew at just under 3% last year, and last year was the year that Trump unleashed his trade war against China.
He also unleashed tax cuts, though.
Correct. The main reason for that rapid growth was a huge fiscal stimulus that came at the end of 2017. But let's put it this way. I can imagine a scenario in which US-China competition, as long as it doesn't involve extended tariff protection, but becomes mainly about technology, will be quite stimulative. The Chinese, after all, have to catch up. They're behind. They can't make all their own semiconductors. They're still dependent on the US for that. So they're pouring money into that sector to try to stimulate it. And on the US side, they're waking up to the reality that China has really got quite close to catching up. So that means almost certainly increased investment, private and public, in high tech. This is kind of what happened in the late 40s and 1950s when the US-Soviet competition, which was about not just nuclear weapons but also space, produced all kinds of unexpected economic benefits. We forget this now, but even the internet was a consequence of that period of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. It came out of the US defense program. The Soviets had their own version, but it failed, hence the internet. So a Cold War isn't necessarily all bad. The thing to remember, though, is that in the Cold War, there were hot wars in a lot of what were then called third world countries. And what I worry about a little is that as the US-China rivalry escalates, whatever may happen in the heartlands, even if they are stimulated by all this technological competition, there may be some peripheral areas where the competition gets nasty. And we already see one of those, which is Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the failed states of the world as a result of disastrous leftist policies by Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolas Maduro. Who has kept that show on the road? Who's kept the Chavista regime in power? That's right, China, with some help from the Russians too. And the United States is now on the side of the revolution that would overthrow Maduro. You know, that's the kind of thing that also reminds me of the Cold War, when it used to be in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Chile, that the Cold War was waged. So there could be some places where this is really bad news.
Niall Ferguson, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.